Okay, great. Well, here we are getting started on our webinar of Becoming Better Allies. Hi, Katia. It's great to have you here joining us. I've really been looking forward to speaking with you. Can you start by telling us a little bit about yourself?
My name is Katia, and I work in public and government relations for Aaron Detler, who is the delegate of the Haudenosaunee Development Institute. Um, I've been working there for a little bit over 2 years, and I've learned so much from when I started. I first became interested in Haudenosaunee rights and governments when I was producing and directing a documentary called Land Back. And the film followed Schuyler Williams and a couple other land defenders who were opposing the housing development that was planned right on the border of Six Nations. And meaningful engagement with the housing development did not take place on that land. I filmed that documentary when I was doing my undergrad in journalism with a couple of other journalists. But that was some time ago. That was probably around 4 or 5 years ago. And I now have a Master's of Public Policy at the Monk School at the University of Toronto. And while I was doing my master's, that's when I started working for HDI. So I was really able to, learn about public policy in the Canadian government and the Ontario government sense, and also learn about Haudenosaunee governance at the same time. And obviously more hands-on because I was working directly with them instead of learning in a school. Um, a little bit more about HDI. As some of you may know, the Haudenosaunee Development Institute is the development arm of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. And we deal in matters often referred to by the Crown as the duty to consult. The Haudenosaunee calls this the duty to engage or the duty to obtain consent. Um, uh, the delegate of the Haudenosaunee Development Institute is authorized to undertake engagement on behalf of the Confederacy in a matter that is consistent with their laws and protocols. So my role is to assist the delegate in those matters, and that includes monitoring public and government activity to ensure that policies or legislative changes are consistent with the Haudenosaunee protocols. And I help identify these issues. I prepare briefings. I meet with people. I spread the word. Follow up with government officials just to make sure that the matter is addressed consistent to our standards. So just to be clear, I'm not Haudenosaunee myself. I just work for HDI and the delegate. So I'm only here to speak about my experiences with the Haudenosaunee and how I believe someone can be a better ally. So yes, thank you for having me today.
Well, and one of the things that you and I were talking about right before this conversation actually started for everyone is that oftentimes the burden is put squarely on Indigenous voices to come to spaces and talk about how they would like to be engaged, what we should be doing. There's a lot of burden of teaching, of like teaching settlers how to be better. And this is kind of a really unique opportunity and a really unique view that you have, Katia, because you are someone who has a great relationship and who can teach other people without maybe carrying some of the same burdens and some of the same uh, challenges that come along with having to always do the training and teaching to teach us how to be better allies in a very, very direct way based on your experience. So some of the acronyms that you just covered briefly there in terms of HCCC, the Haudenosaunee Chiefs Confederacy Council, and HDI, the Haudenosaunee Development Institute. Just again for folks who might not already be super familiar, what's the relationship between these groups? What's the like when people refer to like Six Nations, how does that relate to these two particular groups? Maybe if you just want to take a sec to kind of go through that.
The Haudenosaunee Confederacy Chiefs Council is the true government of the Haudenosaunee. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy was founded by the prophet known as the Peacemaker with the help of Hiawatha. So it has some source of like divinity to it. And this kind of traces back to, the land and the government has been there since time immemorial. There's Six Nations, and the exact joining of all the nations together is unknown. But it is one of the first and longest lasting participatory democracies in the world. And the council is made up of 50 chiefs and 49 clan mothers. So HDI, this is bringing the Confederacy like way into the modern day. HDI is the Haudenosaunee Development Institute, and What they do is that they administer a regulatory framework that identifies, registers, and monitors development on Haudenosaunee territory, and ensures that all development initiatives are consistent with the environmental and cultural values of the Haudenosaunee people. So it has to do a lot with development. We do deal with a lot of project-based things, like in terms of like archaeology and environmental assessment. We also deal with a lot of legislation as well, because legislation is where the mandate gets set, and then the projects kind of follow after that. So, like if the Canadian or if the provincial government says that we're going to build 500,000 houses this year, it would be the projects that therefore follow after that. So we try to um, uh, deal with legislation first, as opposed to dealing with everything on a project basis. Um, uh, but yeah, HCI basically takes direction from the Haudenosaunee Confederacy Chiefs Council, and HCI meets with the HCC monthly, and the chiefs and clan members participate actively in all engagement processes. So, in a way, I always put it to make people understand it is that just think of HCCC as like the government of Canada, just on that level, and they're responsible for taking care of the Haudenosaunee people. And think of HDI as like the Ministry of Infrastructure, but instead of mandating development, we're making sure that development that occurs with treaty territory are upheld to our standards and protocols. And the delegate of HDI, think of him as like the Ministry of Infrastructure. I find when I explain it that way, it makes a lot more sense to people.
Well, thanks. And, I guess kind of hitting the ground running here. Something we hear all the time when it comes to development, our governments routinely frame Indigenous consultations as being red tape, right? The idea is that First Nations always say no, consultation doesn't mean that First Nations have a veto. These are lines that we're seeing all the time from all of our levels of government. And if you think about that, First Nation consultation is not a veto. Like, to me, that actually negates any meaningful conversation. Like, you can't have free, prior, and informed consent. That would be the equivalent of coming to someone and saying, "This is going to happen to you no matter what, but we can talk about compensation." Like, that's not free, prior, and informed consent. So, can you describe maybe what you've seen in your time working there at HDI, or maybe perhaps not seen more aptly from the
Mm-hmm.
process of consultation with First Nations?
So engagement with the Haudenosaunee, it comes from a couple of different streams. So like I said this before, we deal with the government primarily within for archaeology, environmental assessment, and changes within legislation. So since I primarily deal with legislation, I can say that consultation usually doesn't happen unless we say something about it. Um, I find that there's some ministries that are better than others, but the ministries that do send us notifications are usually the ones we built some sort of relationship with. But of course, like that relationship is far from perfect. And almost every meeting we go into, there's obviously some sort of history between the Haudenosaunee and the ministry. So there's a lot of things that come forward. The ministry always asks us to act on things that are like within the present, because they're just trying to push this legislation forward. They're just trying to develop the policy. But usually what happens is that we try to go back to the very beginning, where it's like, well, the entire framework you created was created without consultation. So how could any amendment you make to that framework be justifiable to our standards? It's just hard to do. So we always have to go back to the root and address the root cause before we can move forward into the present. Um, uh, but with that being said, like we have to remember that the people in the government are people too, and there's bad apples in there, but there are some of them who are trying um, uh, to do the best that they can in a system that just doesn't allow them to do that. So we usually go into these meetings and find like our greatest allies, and try to get the most out of them. And most of the times things don't really come out of it, but sometimes there are good moments, and we try and find those good moments with people. Um, so most of the time, and this is usually where the government gets its PR lines by saying that we say no to a project. But we usually say more no to processes opposed to projects, because we come from the stance that engagement must occur early, but most often it happens more downstream. So consultation happens, like I said, when legislators pass, and they try to create like transition boards or tools to like help move the government along. but we believe that engagement should come before legislation is even drafted. So um, in terms of consultation with First Nations and not having a veto, is our position that consultation must come from free, prior, and informed consent. So since we have treaties in established areas, infringement must be justified before a project or policy that infringes on Haudenosaunee rights um, uh, um, and interest like proceeds. So we believe that yeah, engagement must occur before legislation proceeds, before a project proceeds. But of course, like I've never experienced a situation where a treaty right infringement was justified, nor have I ever experienced a situation where we were able to veto a policy or a project through an engagement.
Yeah. And it's a super understandable position to be in. Like everyone on this call is in the position of saying no to developments that are being proposed. Things that are being proposed for profit, things that are being proposed that destroy the land, that are not good for people. Like there's so many reasons that like you're saying, the process of even who's coming forward with projects is so deeply flawed. And, it sounds like, it's just constantly coming back up against that wall of feeling like there's no addressing of the root cause of, why
Mm-hmm.
we ended up here. Each project, you kind of feel, at least it sounds like you're going through some of these same discussions. And something I wanted to ask about specifically, maybe before we look at the more systemic things, I know you met, one of our H350 members, Peter, talking about conservation authorities. What was the process like on that as an example? Like, did the government reach out well in advance and say, hey, we're pondering some changes to conservation authorities. We're interested in getting some feedback. Like what actually happens in some of these really major policy decisions?
So for conservation authorities, they didn't reach out to us. We wrote a letter to them, in which, government is slow. And I don't know if it's just slow because I've only worked with First Nations, so I'm assuming it's slow for everyone else, but for us, it's especially slow. Um, uh, yeah, we reached out to them, and again, like we were opposing process where it's like conservation authorities from the beginning was flawed because we weren't engaged from the onset. So when we were speaking to them, they were trying to get us on board with their transition board and merging the conservation authorities. And they were basically framing the whole transition as like, there's great opportunity for you to be engaged. Um, um, Not necessarily on the transition board, but I believe it was with the watershed authorities. But what we were saying is that this is happening so downstream. Like even the creation of conservation authorities, it was done without um uh Haudenosaunee engagement. So it's like, how can we even, engage now to a point where it's like the system doesn't even include us? And one of the points we brought up is that municipalities are actually like the whole conservation framework authority, sorry, the conservation authority framework was created for municipalities. But municipalities are creatures of the province. First Nations hold constitutional treaty rights. So there should be a system for conservation authorities to also include First Nations. Um, and we brought that up with the meeting, and they received the message, but we'll see where they go with that. They're already so deep into their framework that like it's very hard to believe that they're going to rip up their entire structure and recreate it. Um, uh, but yeah, like usually with things like that, we get engaged so downstream. We're usually the ones reaching out to them. We're usually the ones asking for process in which they should have already done according to case law or their own mandate. Um, uh, so yeah, that was our experience with conservation authorities. That's where we are at right now. We had the meeting, I think, last week.
Wow. And something that I had in my notes to maybe jump to this toward the end of the conversation, but I think this leads into it really well, is that, when we take a look at these policies, whether, and it's at the federal, municipal, but I'll focus in on the provincial level, right? We
Hmm.
see as settler advocates, we see this concentration of wealth and power. We see people who are already well connected pushing through terrible things to try to make a quick buck at the expense of people, the planet, everything. And we look at this and we look at this as a failure. we say that the government is not acting as it should have been set up to act, that the checks and balances, that things like conservation authorities, things that settler environmental groups hold very dear, right? The idea being that like the system has been kind of hijacked by the Ford government, that things are not working the way they're supposed to be working.
Mhm.
And as a result, we're seeing these disastrous policies. But from a Haudenosaunee perspective, as we see new suburbs like running potentially down south in Hamilton out into greenfield land as it's being proposed and white belt land, pushing in towards Six Nations Haldeman Tract land. This probably doesn't look like something different. This probably looks like a continuation of the suburbs that are already there, and maybe even the older developments that first started when Hamilton as a city was started. This probably seems like a pretty logical extension of what Ontario has been doing the whole time. So one of the questions I wanted to ask was, looking at it from that HDI perspective, does it seem like the Ontario government is failing? Is it falling apart, or is it working as intended?
I think it's working exactly how it's intended to be. We have to recognize that Canada is it's a colonial government. It was built off of, the premise that there was people already here and they had to create a government to minimize the rights of the people who are already here. So the systems that were built like from the onset are meant to do that. And anything that goes within the provincial legislature, municipal governments, federal governments, is not consulted with Indigenous people at the very beginning. Like we say in meetings, like even when it's a thought in your brain, you need to consult. Um, uh, because if it goes in without Haudenosaunee consultation through, you know, these legislators, it's at the outcome is always going to be bad. So I think the government is operating exactly how it's intended to operate. Um, with that being said, like there is like it's not that like things can't be fixed. Like I'm an optimistic person. And I know like through my master's degree there are good people who like who work in government and want to do better. They're just operating in a system that just doesn't allow them to do that. Um, um, but I think things can be fixed if process is followed. Like if they listen to HDI and follow their process, like we can exist in a system where, you know, everyone can benefit.
So thinking about opposing the governments, all of the governments, but again, kind of focusing maybe in this discussion on the provincial government lens, right? We as settler groups have a lot to learn from Indigenous groups that have been opposing our governments since their artificial creation, right? That's a long history of fighting back. Maybe before I get to talking about what the relationship between different groups fighting back is, can I ask, like, is there anything that you've seen that you say you're an optimist, you say you're inspired. Where do you see the ability to maybe change some of the system, some of the process? Is it one of those things where it's like, these discussions happen all the time. Some people are like, we got to tear it all down. Other people are like, we got to use what we can within it. Where do you think that you've landed based on what you've seen in your role?
Honestly, I think like goes a little bit outside of my role and more towards personal experience. I think within like the education system, I think if we start having more conversations about especially for people pursuing higher education, like in policy or government political science, we start having earlier conversations um uh with them regarding Indigenous engagement, different governance structures, different rights and how one nation sees something and how another nation sees something, will have more of a chance of, of that permeating into the government. I feel like once you get into the government, you're kind of already, and like, I hope that nobody here works for the government, but like you kind of already like sold your soul a little bit.
Yeah.
Because now you're like part of the system, right? And like your job, your livelihood depends on like being a part of that system. So like even like having conversations with people who are in that system, like they agree, but like it's almost as if they're like, oh, but this is where I work. Like these are where my friends are. This is what my bosses, my coworkers say. All these things. Like they're already like sold into a culture. But I feel like if we start within education systems, like that's the best way to do it. It has to be without the government, without like beyond the walls of the government. Um, um, for that to happen. Um, but yeah, there has been some small acts of kindness, none that I've really have a lot to write home to, but like just some people showing like a lot of like interest and compassion towards us, like in meetings and stuff. But ultimately, like at the end, if when nothing gets changed, like it's kind of like, oh, you were really nice and you tried, but nothing really came out of it. Again, I'm only 2 years in, like I'm still like really green. So like maybe somewhere in my experience I can see something. And when that does, I'll let you guys know. Um, uh, but yeah, I think um changing government has to happen from outside the government.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, our group's inclined to agree that change needs to happen from the people up, right? And one of the things,
Hmm.
mentioned education. Do you think that there's avenues and important work to be done by groups like ours on education, or do you think that there's a supporting role that could be played? Like, I know HDI itself is really focused on development, but a lot of this, idea of informing the public, where do you see the burden of that falling between like settler groups like ours to go and change the minds of people in settler society at large, as opposed to letting that burden fall squarely on Indigenous groups to face
Yeah.
that hostile environment. Like something that I've always had in discussions is this idea of being able to, you know, uh, facilitate some of the things that would be harmful, like actively harmful to Indigenous people, might be a supportive role that a group like ours can play.
Yeah, so I think that like yeah, there is a role to be played by advocacy groups like such as yours, especially like in environmental advocacy groups because there's such like a strong like shared interest in like Indigenous governance and environmental justice. It would be so difficult to put the burden all on Indigenous people just because like our the Haudenosaunee Reserve, the Six Nation Reserve, is one of the largest reserves in Canada. There's only 30,000 registered members. That's it. And it's hard to believe that every single one of them want to take on the burden to advocate for their own rights. So a lot of the work has to be done from the settler people who care for them. But also like understanding that you have to take guidance from them and that like as a settler like you've grown up in a system where it has benefited you and the Haudenosaunee have grown in a system where it hasn't benefited them. So you have to like remove yourself from like certain contexts and sometimes let go of like these really like these beliefs that like some people hold on to and just really listen to them. I feel like that's
Can
the
you
best
give
way to
us,
do
can
it.
you give us an example? Can you give us an example of maybe a time that that happened in your relationship, whether it was working on the land back film, whether it was, in your role at HGI? Like, is there anything that you feel like kind of speaks to that?
I think working in like filming land back made me really realize that like I live in a system where like that was like made off of the backs of like indigenous people because just seeing them like fight for like the last pieces of land that they call theirs. Meanwhile like like my family is able to live and like freely and purchase land and like with no issue. That has really opened my eyes. But besides that, I've always been like a very receptive person. I'm a very open-minded person, and like I feel just through my background in journalism, like I've also did like international journalism and conflict journalism. So I put my myself in places where like I never really like the culture's different and everything's different. Like I'm very like adaptable. But I know with like some other people, they find that when they advocate for Indigenous rights, they're kind of losing their own rights in a sense because um uh when you talk like I feel like the idea of decolonization like scares a lot of people because it's like oh like if we decolonize and like the whole world around me is just going to erupt, but a lot of people don't realize that there could be a way for for governance to be shared together and going forward in a system that benefits everybody. Um, um, so yeah, my personal experience is that like I've always been very open, but I know other people like they're very like they're not very receptive to the idea of just because they've grown up in a system that they feel so comfortable in.
Yeah, and a system that maybe in such a deep way goes back to just being fundamentally different, right? Like if you take a look at borders by and large within European systems, they're quite hard. They're quite, these folks are here, those folks are there. Indigenous
Hmm.
borders are not that way. There's all this overlapping of Indigenous territories. There's all these different peoples that have systems of coexistence, that outlast by far a lot of European and other Western civilizations. And, how the government was set up in the shadow of and in the model of European governments. Do you think that this lack of a blueprint of coexistence is maybe even just part of the starting point? Is like people don't really understand what coexistence means?
Um, yeah, like people don't, some people, like, I remember when I went to journalism school, like one of the first stories that I've ever did was about residential schools because at that time it was still Ryerson University and like there was still the statue and like the whole name change was like a big topic of conversation. And I remember I was going around to people on university campus asking them what they know about residential schools, and a lot of them had no idea. Um, uh, my partner, he's Irish. He's an immigrant, and he says in Ireland you have no idea that there's Indigenous people. So the fact that a lot of people just don't know in general, because like a lot of people don't live near a reserve period. I remember even growing up because I grew up in Vaughan. Like I never met like an Indigenous person like prior to me like going onto the reserve and doing the documentary. Um, um, I think the fact that just people don't know, and this kind of goes back to like the education system. Like if more people are educated that these people exist, um, uh, then a lot of people will be more tolerant and understanding because I remember what a land defender said to me. It's like if the Canadian government is able to do this to Indigenous people, they're able to do it to anybody else. So you want to treat your others the way you would want yourself to be treated. So like Indigenous rights and respecting their rights is almost in turn like respecting the right of like every person within this country. Um, but yeah, again, it goes right back to education, and just like acknowledging that these people exist and that they're there.
Yeah, and as you're talking about, right, in terms of people being treated this way, we're seeing it. We're seeing it in real time. We're seeing people's, systematically every single policy that comes out, federal, provincial, it is restricting the role of citizens being able to participate in what is ostensibly a participatory democracy.
Hmm.
Can I maybe get you to talk a little bit about your what you've seen from your experience, like Skylar and Layla were at an event that we did in person last month. We had a film screening of Boil Alert. They're fantastic land defenders, really inspiring people. When you took on the role of building a relationship through filming this movie, through doing things, as you're kind of saying, you went in knowing very little, if I could
Hmm.
say nothing, right? And when it comes to building relationships, do you think that in some ways that openness is a big piece of it, not going in with preconceived ideas of what you're going to get out of it? I know in a lot of the land conservation space, we go through this process where lots of folks, like when priorities align and there's this partnering with Indigenous allies, and then other times it feels like that, no one's there to be found. No allies are around when it's not something that's like a convenient battle. How do you
Hmm.
recommend that this can change, that relationships can be kind of real relationships that outlast a particular campaign or a particular issue?
So I think that like doing things like this, like having me here is like always a good step in the right direction. And having open and honest conversation with people who are Haudenosaunee or work for the Haudenosaunee is also a good first step in understanding our relationship and how we operate together. Um, and like you said, like we do tend to like talk to each other like in times of crisis. So it's like I reached out to Peter during conservation authorities because he was very active on the issue, and it was something that was affecting HDI as well. But we should be reaching out to each other like almost all the time because we do have like we have a shared area of interest, and we can just learn so much from each other. Like I can learn more about because I know more about Indigenous rights and governance than I do know about like climate and environmental justice, even though those issues overlap together. So I just think having conversations that are not centered around a time of crisis would do wonders to build real relationships with the Haudenosaunee. And also another good way to be an ally is to reach out to HDI when you believe that there is a treaty infringement or activity from a government or private entity that is infringing on treaty rights. So, like even like if there's like a project within Haudenosaunee territory and you don't know if they're engaged or if there's a piece of legislation that you heard about or even rumblings within the government, like it's always a good idea just to reach out to someone from HDI just to notify them that this is happening. Because sometimes we don't get notified and things like pass us and we get engaged later in the process. But like the delegate always says to me, it's always better late than never. So like that's also another good way to build a relationship is just to notify us when you think that there's something that could be of interest to us.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I wanted to open the floor to people who might have questions because I know we're already flying through. I feel like we could talk all evening. Does anyone have anything that they would like to ask Katia, either maybe about a specific project, or building off something we've talked about, something new? Jim, would you like to go ahead?
Sure. Thanks, Katia, for coming and filling us in on all of this stuff. I have a larger question, but I'll start with an easy one. What is the best who's the best contact for us to reach out to at HDI? If, for instance,
You,
we notice something that HDI should be aware of.
yeah, you can reach out to me. It's Katia at HDI dot land. Um, uh, And I'm usually the best point of contact. Sorry, it's Katia at hdito.com. I'm usually the best point of contact. Usually when you reach out to like other email addresses at HDI, like those like inboxes usually get very overburdened. So it's hard for them to like filter through all the things that they need to go through and then see like an email from one of you guys. But yeah, I'm usually the best contact.
Okay. Now I've noticed, at least I what I perceived to be going on was that often when the government wants to do something, wants to push a project through or whatever, that in 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 groups that have both a confederacy or a traditional government or
Hmm.
traditional governance system and the imposed band council system, that they tend to go to the band council system because it's an
Hmm.
easier way in, because the people that are in the band council generally have kind of bought into
Hmm.
the way that we do things in North America. And from what you're saying, it sounds as though that HDI is consulted quite a bit. But I wonder, is there a tendency really when things are contentious or would seem negative towards Six Nations to go to band council instead of the Confederacy?
Yeah, I would say like it's so easy for the government to default to the band council because they're an Indian Act band council. So it's like almost like every like indigenous person would be represented by their council, so it makes sense for them like procedurally like just to go that route. And also, yeah, like you said before, like they already bought into the system, and they also receive so much funding from the government. We don't receive a dime from them ever. So like
So
they're
there's
more like, yeah, they're more likely to be more in agreement to like what the federal and provincial governments are saying, and we're more likely to be like, you have to follow, our government protocols. You have to engage with us early. There's a lot more like conditions to be met before we give them the final yes, if we ever get to a final yes. Um, uh, so for them, like they know that the general public is not following their engagement protocol in such detail. And they know that most people don't even know that there's a confederacy structure and an elected band council. So what they'll do is that if we are too difficult, they'll just, default to the elected band council, and then they'll tell the public, we've engaged with the Indigenous people and they all said yes to us. Meanwhile, we were the ones who are still asking for deeper and more meaningful consultation.
Right. And you're very up on policy issues and so on. So my sense of situations when government is dealing with Indigenous peoples is that they will go to the band council, even though the band council, as I understand it, is only responsible for the actual reserve. And the
Mm-hmm.
Confederacy, the traditional governance system, is responsible for the whole territory, the whole natural lands
Mm-hmm.
that particular group is on, really. So I think the best example is probably the Wet'suwet'en situation, where all the
Mm-hmm.
band councils approve of a pipeline, and all of the Confederacy chiefs disapprove. And
Mm-hmm.
my take on that is that sure, so the band council people can approve. They're approving a pipeline going through the reservation only, not the natural, not the traditional lands. So
Mm-hmm.
realistically, then a pipeline needs to be approved by the traditional governance system that oversees the traditional lands. In my view, is that fair? Is that
Yeah, so our jurisdiction is a lot more broad than the elected band council, because the elected band council just oversees the reserve, and we oversee, like, the broader territory. And also we deal with like the Haudenosaunee people. So there's 6 nations that are within the Haudenosaunee, and we see governance on behalf of people who hold that, like, nationality, if that makes sense. Um, uh, we don't have like clear lines on a map jurisdiction, although we do broadly go by the 1701 NANFAN. And again, I'm just speaking from my experience. This would probably better be coming from a delegate or someone who works within the government. But the HCCC do have 8 points of jurisdiction. You can find it on their website, but they seem to intervene on government matters that pertain to those 8 points of jurisdiction. And that's how they, decide like what projects and to what extent they would be interested in. I
thanks
hope
very
that
much?
makes sense.
Yeah, thanks.
Great. Thanks, Jim. Does anyone else have any other questions? Feel free to raise your hand. Now's a great opportunity to ask Katia. I mean, Katia, thanks for providing your email, and I'm sure we'll be in touch with lots of happenings that we keep up with, here in the Hamilton area. But I wanted to ask in terms of, some of the other big projects in Hamilton. One of the things that folks here would know, we've got lots happening, whether it's looking at steel, whether it's looking at proposed data centers, whether it's looking at all sorts of things. Like, I remember seeing HGI in the news around the big sewage leak in Shadow Creek and the cleanup. But like, has there been
Mm,
really anything since that HGI has been involved with in Hamilton? And certainly, just as you said, a good call to action for us is making sure that we are really reaching out on all of these things, right? Our group has been active on things like the Gardner Marsh, and I don't know that our group has been active in following those processes to reach out.
Shadow Creek, that happened before I joined. So like I remember when I joined, I was definitely playing catch up on that issue. I We did reach out to them again, um, uh, but we haven't met with them. And that's the most I know on that situation. I like I try and like learn about things I did like before I was there. But when it comes to issues like that, I usually just take direction from the delegate and I just let him know what to do because I'm coming from it. Like I don't have like I wasn't there when it happened, so like I just if he tells me to write a letter, I write a letter and I send it. But we haven't met on that issue again. But I believe there was a small amount of movement on it, but
Yeah.
besides that, I haven't heard much.
I see Don has his hand up. I'm just going to quickly ask Jen's question in the chat, which is, do you know if Slate Asset Management or any of the other industrial land holders have reached out to HDI?
No, I'm not sure. Are these like these would be proponents or would these be like
Yeah.
Yeah, these are people that are putting forward like fairly significant development projects in and around Hamilton waterfront. And I know because I was in attendance at the Community Advisory Committee meeting that I did not see any First Nations present.
I'm not entirely sure.
So,
I know we have somebody, so I deal more with like legislation and policy. I know we do have like a project space person who would probably know more about that, but no, I haven't heard anything on those.
okay. Well, good flag for us to follow up and make sure that we're sending all of these things your way. Don,
Yeah,
go ahead.
Yeah, thanks very much, Lucia, and thanks, Katia, for joining us and providing this information. Um, you mentioned the size of the uh, what's called the Six Nations Reserve, I guess. Uh, and I know that the folks in the Anishinaabe, the Mississaugas of the Credit, is a very small group comparatively, but even with a group the size of the Six Nations, uh, I would assume that one of the challenges is that there's all sorts of things going on that government is involved in one way or another and should be consulting with. Uh, but if they came in and said, "Okay, we're going to do this," and you'd be dragged into 20 or 30 or 40 meetings over several years in order to get to the point of actual decision. Um,
mhm.
how do you deal with that? Do you know what I mean, it just seems to me like you can talk all you want about consultation, but it's not going to be something that's going to happen on every level all the way along, or the Haudenosaunee or Anishinaabe or whoever is not going to have the number of personnel and time
Yeah.
to be able to do those things. So how does that work?
I know this happens. Like we've never, okay, so for legislation, so what I deal with primarily, we've never gone to a point where it's like we've asked for capacity funding because it's going to take like a whole team of people to like review the legislation um uh, and like provide amendments and all that stuff. That usually happens more on like report review processes. So like when we do a lot of this with like archaeology, which is like a key point of development, and environmental assessments. When it comes to a point where it's like you have to review project files, um uh, and you have to like provide amendments and you have to make sure that it's up to your standards and consistent with your treaty rights. It takes a lot of work, and actually a lot I from what I've seen, like a lot of proponents get like really surprised when we ask for money because they think that this is something that we should just be doing for free. But I know that the delegate always brings up, it's just like, well, you wouldn't expect like any other person to do work for free. Like how could we do work for free? People still need to like eat and live. So yeah, the capacity funding is always like a part of the conversation because we just can't be doing work for free, especially when we're we're actively participating within the project. Um, um, but yeah, that happens more on the project based in term opposed to engagement with the government. Because I haven't really seen it gotten to a point where it's like, okay, we're in the decision making chair of like reviewing legislation and now we need like a team of people to do this. Um, um, but yeah, hopefully that answers your question.
It's really helpful. And one of the things that if I can add something else, we're seeing from the provincial government and the federal government at this point is introducing and passing legislation which eliminates consultation processes, which basically says we have free reign to do whatever we want here, and we don't have to consult with it. We don't have to go through an environmental assessment. We don't have to go through normal consultation processes. And that must be problematic for the Haudenosaunee and the Indigenous people generally. Is that being addressed? Is there some indication that, well, we don't really mean that in terms of Indigenous because we have to do that by the law?
And I think we're talking about here specifically Bill 5 or Bill C5.
Yeah, and special economic zones. Yeah. So those have to, like, there's no guardrails on like special economic zones. So the province of Ontario can really deem like whole municipality a special economic zone. But from how the government has played out so far, it tends to seem that they're choosing like much larger projects. Like I know Billy Bishop they might make that a special economic zone. So in terms of like the broader engagement framework, we haven't been actually really too affected by that. In fact, there's almost too much work for us to do where we don't have capacity to keep track of all of them. But yeah, we have been seeing like the provincial government consolidate power within the hands of the government, and they're trying to remove like local decision making authority and local knowledge, and we can see that through conservation authorities. But in terms of special economic zones in Bill 5, yes, consultation was removed, which is unlawful, and it does not adhere to our governance processes, because we should be consulted on every project, doesn't matter what size or scope. But in terms of the broader engagement framework, the effect is not as big as I think a lot of people. Don't get me wrong. There's treaty infringements that this law should have never been passed, but the way the government is using it right now has to do with larger projects. Doesn't have to do with the smaller, minute projects that are across the province. But with that being said, those bigger projects usually have larger implications, and there's usually more leverage for us to push our message through. So it does like hinder us in some way. But a lot still gets done, even with special economic zones being a thing. Let's just not hope that Doug Ford like casts a huge special economic zone over like a whole municipality or like a massive region. That would be like definitely more detrimental. But yeah, that's just been through our experience with it. Like, it's the individual big projects that get affected the most, not the everyday projects that we are engaging with. So there's still work to be done.
Yeah, and it sounds, Katia, if I can maybe use a bit of a phrase, it seems like it's just kind of a bit of a mask off moment, maybe for settler society to see how this is functioning in practice. Is that kind of a fair assessment in terms of like, you're saying that yes, it's important and it affects us, but also it feels a little bit like this is how things have been going?
Yeah, no, things have been going. I think like since Ford was reelected, like slowly, like decision-making authorities are being consolidated within the hands of the government. Bill 5 and special economic zones are just one thing, but there's a larger issue going on with archaeology and that's another like area that we're more involved in. I know this is kind of out of the purview of like an environment and environmental justice and stuff, but I know archaeology holds a lot of deep cultural significance to the Haudenosaunee. But I believe what's happening within that realm of the government, like archaeological processes and stage archaeology and the standards of archaeology, you can see it more there where they're starting to remove avenues of Indigenous engagement and like they're starting to like cut us out of the picture. Yeah, it's just it's slowly. Yeah, there's a larger picture that we can see where it's like our ways to assert our governance are being removed within the Canadian government. But without being said, like we can always assert governance without them because we've been doing it since time immemorial. So yeah, it is part of a broader pattern.
I'm going to throw it to Susan and then I'll come back to a question in the chat. Susan, go ahead.
Hi there. Thanks, Katia. I was wondering, you mentioned the band council gets money, but you don't get any money. How are you funded?
Mhm. We're funded primarily through um proponents, through like engaging with proponents. Like we receive capacity funding through them. I don't really deal with that side too much, so like I'm not really 100% sure. We don't collect taxes for the Haudenosaunee people. Like we don't have tax on reserve. But there's like a number of revenue streams. I just don't know if I have too much experience to speak about it, but I know we do get some funding from proponents to review projects. But that's like the only revenue stream I'm aware of. I don't really talk too much about money. I just deal with government stuff. That's it. I've never taken money from the government ever. I've never been in a room where we took money from the government. So I can say from what I've seen, I haven't seen it.
And you don't get money from the band council.
No, definitely not.
Yeah. Okay, thanks.
Robin asked a question in the chat and says, is there a role that you facilitate with the FOI process, like requesting information? Is there still a channel that we can navigate while the Ford government is removing the FOI, so the freedom of information? So, just wondering if there's anything in First Nations or treaty law that would allow you to continue to have access to what the government is doing. Or are you guys also relying on things like FOI to try to get information about like projects happening on, Haudenosaunee land?
I wish there was a way we can get information from the government through treaty rights. There's not a way. Like even before I started working for HDI when I was a journalist, I used to send FOIs and like even that, like prior before all these changes, it was hard to get information out of the government. I find the best way to do it is to just talk to them. You would be surprised what people will tell you, off or on the record. I know like data and like having records, like physical records, are so valuable. But I think just by having conversations with them, is probably the best way to get information out of them. Um, and yeah, I wish there was a way, but almost I don't think I've ever gotten an FOI back and I've gotten what I wanted. And even my friends, like a lot of them are investigative journalists and they always have hard times with FOIs as well. But there are some good things that come out of them. But yeah, it's super difficult.
Yeah, well, it sounds like Robin found that both really frustrating and also super helpful. So thanks for sharing that.
You'd be surprised what people tell you, trust me.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And I guess quick call for any final questions. I know we're already at 8 o'clock, so I'm gonna look at maybe trying to wrap it up. But quick final call, is there anything that people wanted to ask? Katia, thanks again for spending some time and talking with us. One of the things that I wanted to based on the conversation, come back to is like any any final takeaways from you in terms of where to go next? Where like we have a really depressing battle ahead, right? We've got an entire system that has spent hundreds of years doing terrible things to lands all across Canada, people all across Canada. And it's continuing. And now, increasingly, settler society is finding themselves in the same boat as Indigenous peoples have been. Not even remotely on the same scale, but just in terms of, the things that people kind of considered themselves, like you said, buying into the system because it was advantageous to them, is disappearing. And the nature of the system is being laid very bare. And this, if you really kind of stop and understand what you're seeing, is really distressing because it's like, well, where do we go from here? What do we do? And so I guess maybe a throw for some optimism on, what do
Hmm.
you see? What keeps you optimistic? You're studying public policy, but also see how
I
much
graduated,
how
thank
much
God.
how much congratulations, but also like how terrible the current public policy is. What keeps you feeling hopeful that things can change, and how might we be able to push for that?
Well, there's so many people fighting the same fight. And, you know, as flawed as Canada is, I believe that there are good people in this country um, uh, who want a solution for everybody. And we have to just keep having these conversations, keep talking. We can find a middle ground for everybody where everybody benefits in the system. There's been times in my experience within government where I look at the government policy and it's just like no one's benefiting from this. So, you know, Indigenous people aren't benefiting from this. Regular settlers are not benefiting from this. There's always a path forward, and there's a way to live together. There was a time, where Indigenous people and settlers lived together on the land, like prior to when Canada was had become a country, and they were living together and they were figuring it out, and like we can always um uh you know even though it wasn't perfect, we can find a way forward so that it can be beneficial for everybody. So yeah, just keep being optimistic. There's always good people out there. Yeah, thank you for having me.
Yeah, well, it seems we've got lots of thanks coming in the chat. Thank you so much, Katia, for spending some time with us, and for talking us through it. I'm sure this is not going to be the end of a relationship, at least between our group and HDI, in terms of, sharing information and reaching out when it's not a time of crisis, as you've said. So thank you so much.
Thank you.